Hey there, initiates. Number 13 here with a quick note about the future of this podcast. Before you panic, no, we're not going on hiatus or anything like that. Let's shut that down right now. Now, when the podcast first started, we had high hopes there would be a flood of people interested in contributing their stories. But let's face it was downright Pollyanna-ish to expect a sudden flood of story submissions. I appreciate all those who have contributed, like Dorothy and Alex and Rob and Rod and Michael and Robert and Charlotte and Sam and Jen and Gator and Chris. But let's face it, despite that long list of names, this is basically a one-man show. I'm fine with that, but it did lead me to set an overly optimistic production schedule, which assumed that by now I'd be producing 3 or 4 episodes every series. Instead, I'm producing somewhere between 6 to 8. As a result, I'm flirting with burnout. So starting with this episode, we're switching to a new release schedule that'll help combat that. There will be no more distinct series with breaks between them. Instead, new episodes will be released every 3 weeks. You will still be getting the same number of episodes, they'll just be more evenly distributed throughout the year. Bonus episodes will be a bit rarer. I will still use them to present supplementary material like interviews or commentary or excerpts from Washington Irving books that don't fit into the main episode. The shorter standalone bonus episodes will just become regular episodes. Errata episodes will still drop every 24 episodes or so, unless I suddenly stop making mistakes. Fingers crossed. Just to clarify, we are still taking show ideas from others. Right now, number 6 and number 7 have some irons in the fire, so does number 42, and I have a few episodes that might require the legal expertise of number 2 and 23. Well, that's out of the way. Let's get on with the correction and updates. But first, shots. Praise be to the Grand Jackalope and her mysterious ways. Smooth. Since the release of Hurricane Coming Through about baseball's designated runner Herbert Lee Washington, there have been some major changes in Herb's life. In early 2021, he sued McDonald's, alleging that the company discriminated against minority franchisees by limiting their ability to expand outside of inner-city markets. Rather than let the case go to trial, McDonald's chose to settle the lawsuit for $33.5 million and buy out Washington's remaining franchises. In the YouTube comments on He Whooped to See Him Burn, Brian Zolkowski claims Simon Gertie was not in Gnadenhutten after the Moravian massacre, and that the man who whooped as Colonel Crawford burned to death was one of Simon's brothers, either James or George. That opens up intriguing possibilities, but seems to contradict the eyewitness testimony of Dr. Knight. Unfortunately, Brian did not provide any sources I could follow up with. Hopefully one of you can enlighten me. There has been no real news about the Icelander Thorfinn Karlsefni over the last year, but his wife Guthrid did make headlines. In April 2022, a statue of Guthrid called The First White Mother in America was removed from its pedestal in Snaefellsnes, Iceland during the middle of the night. It resurfaced a few days later in Reykjavik, stuffed into a model rocket ship by 2 artists who intended to launch it into space as a comment on the imperialist and racist ideology that led to the statue's creation. You can find the whole story up on Hyperallergic, it's great. As of January 2023, the Thorfinn Karlsefni statue has yet to be returned to Fairmount Park. Guthrid, though, is already back in Snaefellsnes. After The Prophet of the Pacific aired, I was contacted by several of Iris Park's descendants. While we were trying to figure out if any of his possessions had ever made their way back to his family, we stumbled across an article saying that several items had wound up in the Miami County Museum in Peru, Indiana. One of those items was Spark's gun. If that had been recovered from the wreck of the Dauntless, that puts the lie to the rumor that he had been attacked by cannibals who wanted to take it from him. If you're near Peru, could you maybe check in with the museum and see if the gun is still on display? I doubt it, but I'd love to know one way or the other. In the YouTube comments for Suffered Little Children, a faithist dropped by to inform me that the Shalem colony in New Mexico actually had a written charter. However, the only evidence they provided was a 30-minute long video, which consists of still images of a 274-page book on faithism. I don't have time to skim through that stuff, and they declined to provide any more details. So let's mark this one as contested and leave it at that. With regards to You Are Who You Eat, many people have pointed out that the alcoholic version of an Arnold Palmer is a John Daly and not a Tim Daly as we reported. John Daly is a golfer. Tim Daly is Joe from Wings, or the voice of Superman if you prefer. I'm going to assume this is some sort of Mandela effect, and I have slipped into an alternate universe where Tim and John switched names. On the YouTube version of Westward Huss, our series about spurious Viking relics found throughout the United States, user CGM1997 wondered aloud why the markings on Dighton Rock were so vivid if they were ancient. Actually, there's a simple answer for that. Due to the limitations of early photographic techniques, most photographers filled in the markings on the rock with chalk to make them stand out. This actually creates its own set of problems because during the chalking process you have to figure out which markings are intentional and which ones are natural, accidental, or have been added later. Dighton Rock is actually one of the easier cases because the markings are relatively deep. Compare that to the Westward Night, where the markings are relatively shallow, and it's now unclear what is an original petroglyph and what has been gouged into the soft stone by amateur archaeologists suffering from pareidolia. That wasn't all CGM 1997 had to say. On Tales from the Cryptid, the episode about the set animal or Shah, they noted that the short-necked giraffe bears an uncanny resemblance to depictions of the Shah. And I agree. The problem with identifying the Shah as a short-necked giraffe is why anyone would choose something as gentle and inoffensive as a short-necked giraffe as the totem animal for a god of strength, violence, and chaos. As much as I hate to say it, I don't think we'll ever know what the Shah is supposed to represent. I bet an ancient Egyptian would have easily been able to decode the iconography and symbolism of its depiction, but we're just missing the cultural context necessary to truly understand it. Initiate number 23 asked a penetrating question about Wonder Marvelously. How on earth did Jeffrey Pike plan on moving something as large and ungainly as the Habakkuk iceberg ship? I thought I'd address this in the episode itself, but apparently I just completely forgot. The short answer is that electric motors would drive submerged propeller screws, 6 on each side of the iceberg ship. Multiple propellers allowed the ship to move surprisingly quickly and also provided redundancy. They also removed the need for a rudder, since you could maneuver the ship by turning off the propellers on one side or the other, tank tread style. The Admiralty insisted on a rudder anyways, and one was added to appease them. Drawing on his experience in Vietnam, number 23 also asked how it would be physically possible for planes to take off and land from Habakkuk, since it would be virtually impossible for the craft to maintain the required speeds. 30 knots into the wind, I think he said. The short answer is that takeoff and landing standards were very different for propeller-driven World War II-era aircraft, especially lightweight British planes made of wood. Having said that, those standards did change rapidly during the war, and Habakkuk would not have been able to serve as a carrier for most of the planes in service by war's end. This was one of many factors that contributed to the project's demise, though hardly the primary factor. Someone complained about an anachronism in the episode Your Heart's Sorrow. I will gladly admit that the Junior Jumble wasn't created until 1970, so there's no way that Christian K. Ross could have been doing it in the evening paper. This is what's called a joke. I was originally going to say he was doing the crossword puzzle, except that wasn't invented until 1913 either, so instead I went with the most ludicrous example I could think of. Apparently it wasn't ludicrous enough. Regarding A Warning to Future Man, friend of the podcast Jim shares the fact that editor Raymond Arthur Palmer's teenage friends Julie Schwartz and Mort Weisinger went on to be editors at DC Comics. In 1961 they honored their old friend by giving his name to a superhero, the Atom. The Silver Age version that shrinks from Legends of Tomorrow, and not the Golden Age version who's just a short dude with a Napoleon complex. Thanks, Jim. Someone asked why Air Crash Museum, the episode on the Navy's rigid airship program, did not include a mention of the DN-1, the Navy's first dirigible from way back in 1917. The answer is simple. The DN-1 was a blimp and not a rigid airship, which is a pity, because otherwise the DN-1 would have fit right in with its cousins in the Z-series. The contractor, the Connecticut Aircraft Corporation, had no experience building airships and liked to cut corners. The blimp was so heavy it could barely stay aloft. On its first test flight, it sank into shallow water, and the captain invited spectators to come on board for the ship's first submerged flight. The Navy removed one of the DN-1's engines to lighten the load, and the ship just barely passed its second test flight. Or it would have if the extra strain on the remaining engines hadn't burned out the transmission and threatened to set fire to the entire ship. Repairs took a week, and then the DN-1 was damaged yet again while being towed to the site of its third test flight. The Navy decided it wasn't worth repairing, and who can blame them? In the episode Worse Than Frankenstein, I pointed out that the time between the search party setting out and returning was only 15 minutes. The round-trip distance was about a mile, which involved trekking uphill in the dark and operating a secured gate, implying that their encounter with the Flatwoods monster lasted mere moments. Friend Jim pointed out that the search party had even less time than we suggested, since they would have presumably had to undo the gate on the way back down the hill. Yes and no. According to contemporary accounts, everyone just vaulted over the fence on the way back down rather than waste time fiddling with the gate. Yes, even Mrs. May in her work dress. Presumably poor, half-conscious Jean Lemon was just hurled over the fence by the older boys. I found myself wondering why our recent episode, 7 Minutes in Heaven on William Dudley Pelley, had been doing numbers, or well, what passes for doing numbers in these parts. I did not realize that I was piggybacking off interest in a far more popular podcast, Rachel Maddow's Ultra, which is about the disastrous prosecution of U.S. versus McWilliams. Now, there are several instances where Maddow presents a version of events that's at odds with our own version of events. I will gladly concede she has more information about the prosecution of McWilliams than I do, and has access to both primary sources and the latest scholarship, which I don't. However, when it comes to Pelly and the Silver Legion, there are more substantial differences. First, Maddow claimed the 2 Marines who were drilling the Silver Legion in San Diego did not voluntarily turn in their students. I went back to check my sources after hearing that, and found them to be ambiguous at best. That's enough for me to issue a warning, if not a correction, but it doesn't really change anything about the overall story. On the other hand, Maddow also makes one statement which is demonstrably false, that Pelly's securities fraud prosecution happened after the collapse of the McWilliams case instead of 8 years earlier. It makes me wonder what other facts she might be getting wrong, and blunts the message of the podcast somewhat. Which is a pity, because I think right now we desperately need to hear its message that right-wing authoritarian movements have been a problem in this country for a long time, and that it's time to stop kicking this particular can down the road. With regards to the episode 520%, Initiate number 23 asked where exactly Colonel Robert Ammon came from. The answer is in the episode, Pittsburgh's South Side, but the pedant in me feels obligated to point out that at the time of Ammon's birth, the South Side was an independent municipality called Birmingham, which was only absorbed into the city proper in 1872. I left that detail out of the episode for brevity's sake. And that's it for our pile of corrections and addenda. I'll see you in 3 weeks with a new episode we're calling Gone Guy. Until then, as always, quicquid minime sciant, optime scire.